I'll start as I usually do by asking people to close their eyes. If you close your eyes, and if you're able to, maybe put your feet on the ground. If you're able to, put your hands on the ground. And just take a moment to be here. Taking a moment here to appreciate the people of this land, to acknowledge it. We're here right now. To acknowledge yourself, whatever it is that brought you. Whether it was your feet, or a car, or your parents, or your entire lineage. And just to drop into the presence of your own experience right now. Take a moment to think about what you're doing here. What brings you to the Women's Visionary Congress? This epic gathering of incredible people. That might be a good segue into sharing some of my own gratitude for the organizers for doing this for so many years and for inviting me to join this year as one of the token men. I'm so grateful to be part of this community, really, really, really. It's such a huge honor, huge, huge honor. I'm so grateful. So thank you, Annie, for the invitation, and thank you, Maria, and everyone else on the team, Danielle and everyone for putting this together. I know it was a lot of effort, and I know that there were some changes in dates and places, and just like props to you all for making it happen. Can we actually give them a round of applause while we're in a little meditative round of applause while we're like fully dropped in. I also really want to appreciate the effort to make this event reflect today's psychedelic, entheogenic, post-status quo paradigm that we're trying to build. I'm really grateful for that. And before I actually tell you who I am and what I do, for those of you that don't already know me, I want to have one more moment of just like dropping in. So maybe if your eyes aren't still closed, bring yourself back to that. And I want you to meditate for a second on what it would be like if the world was just. What you would be doing if the world was just. What would it mean to you to live in a world that was just? What would it mean to your family? What would it mean to your ancestors? What would it mean to your children and theirs? What would it mean to live in a world that is just? Sometimes people have a happy place. I want you to go to your just place. What is the place where things are in balance, in equilibrium? And I invite you to hold that space over the course of this talk, over the course of this experience, not just in the next 40 minutes or so, 30 minutes or so, while I speak a bit about what I see this world can be like when we bring justice and balance to it, but also throughout the weekend and moving forward. Hold that feeling, that image, that possibility. You might not even be able to actually grasp it right now. It might be beyond what we're capable of thinking of at the time. It's really, really hard to imagine what that would actually be like for people who've experienced so much injustice for such a long time. But that doesn't mean we can't hold it and slowly, bit by bit, seed by seed, piece by piece, weave it into the reality that we're actually living in. I really want to thank Maya for that incredible opening presentation. Thank you so much. That was amazing, amazing, amazing. A ton of information in a very like beautifully communicated format. So major props. Thank you so much. I feel like it was a really good setup for like this whole weekend of a tremendous diversity. I don't know if you've actually looked through that, like the list of who's speaking this weekend, but there's a huge amount of subjects going on. So I'm just acknowledging that because I'm about to take a whole sharp turn into a different direction of content. So I just want to appreciate the herbs for a second before we go into like talking about the law and how the drug war is really, really bad. So my name is Ismail Ali, or Izzy. People know me as Izzy. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Council at MAPS, as Annie so wonderfully introduced. And I'm more than just what I do for work. I do work with the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, educating lawyers and judges around the world about entheogenic plant medicine and how DMT and ayahuasca are not, in fact, the same thing, for example, or how the practice and protection of traditional medicine work is different than the perception of the drug crime that people at the borders of various countries around the world are really, really focused on stopping. And although my work with MAPS and with Students for Sensible Drug Policy and the Ayahuasca Defense Fund does bring me into this world of legal doublespeak and trying to understand exactly what the structure of the system that we live in currently operates and how to navigate it, I'm also an explorer myself. I like to say that I practice Islamawaska, which is exactly what it sounds like. I was raised Muslim, I still identify as Muslim, but my work and my experiences have brought me to plant medicine, have brought me to really learn how to integrate this practice of engaging with entheogenic practices from a variety of traditions and integrating that into Islam and into the idea of surrendering to the way, whatever that means, and vice versa, in a lot of different directions. That will be a talk for at some point in the future, but I bring that up as a way of introduction because it's easy, I think, especially in this world, to really focus on like what we're doing and how we're doing it. And although that's critically important, I'm really trying to hold space for the many layers of our identities, and I know many of you here, and I don't know many of you here, but I suspect that every single one of you has layers to your identity that are not always available in the first round of introductions and the first rounds of conversations, and I really appreciate the willingness to go into that depth. Just to give you an idea of like what's going on in my world before I actually dive into a whole bunch of things. I flew from Tunisia this morning. I was just at the World Ayahuasca Conference in Girona, Spain 2 weeks ago, and from there I went to RightsCon, which is a conference about human rights in the digital age to talk about the intellectual property protection of indigenous plant practices in medicine context, in medicinal context at RightsCon. And tomorrow I'll be going to a retreat where I'll be working with other MAPS staff to develop the first therapy training program exclusively for people of color, which will be in August of this year. So we're developing the whole agenda tomorrow, basically, and this weekend. So I have traveled a long way, but I actually, before going on, like really want to appreciate that. I do live in Oakland. I'm so grateful. Part of the tremendous privilege I have of traveling and seeing and participating in these different conversations really brings me back to how incredible this community is and how incredible our community is, and I really want to hold space. And I want you all to just like applaud yourselves right now because you're so cool, and I'm so grateful to be here. Like really, it's incredible. So today, just to give a bit of a roadmap, I was asked by Annie to, before going into the actual topic, like what it means to be doing psychedelic science after prohibition, whatever that even means, to give a little bit of an update. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of an update about what MAPS is doing and where we're at. I know that a great many of you are already familiar with our work and familiar with kind of the work that we do, but I'll give a really brief, super recent update of what's going on with the trials that we're working on. And after that, I'm going to give a little bit of a reality check with 3 different phases: the shadow, the alchemy, and the light. The shadow being, what do you mean we don't live in a just world already? The alchemy being, what the heck has to change and how? And then the light, what could that look like? Which you've already kind of started touching on because you all sat with that earlier today already. So starting with just some of the kind of literal context here. So I just have to do this because although I know this is a friendly audience, I really would like to know so I don't repeat too much. How many here are familiar with MAPS already? That's about 98%. Okay, there's like one person that didn't raise their hand, but that's okay. So many of you already know that we're taking MDMA through the FDA process. That's something that Rick and that the clinical team and that MAPS has been doing now for almost 20 years. Many of you already know that we expect to have MDMA approved by FDA in about 2021. That date has not changed. We're still looking at about 2 years from now at a point that happens. And the most recent update is that we have 13 out of the 13 sites of the phase 3 that are open, and 9 sites of those have already treated 1 participant. So we are like officially actually having started phase 3, which is super exciting. And in addition to that, we're working with a number of other groups. So of course, we've got incredible momentum with the phase 3 MDMA for PTSD studies. But we've also, something that some of you may be less familiar with is the fact that we've started to work with other investigators to do other kinds of studies that aren't sponsored by MAPS, but that are still relevant to this kind of universe. So for example, working with MDMA in conjunction with CBT, MDMA with exposure therapy, which when I heard was like, whoa, kind of intense, but I'm glad that someone's doing it. MDMA for eating disorders, and also MDMA in group therapy, which is a really, really significant piece potentially of the access puzzle, which I'll get to in a bit. But the idea that we're now moving forward with group therapy, with MDMA and a number of other modalities and indications is really exciting, because while the way FDA approval works means that we will only be able to, at least initially, practitioners will initially only be able to prescribe MDMA for PTSD, which is the indication that's being sought for. The fact is that because these other studies are happening, we're building a body of knowledge that suggests that this substance can be used in these other contexts, and then potentially applicable more broadly than just kind of the indication that we're currently working with. But of course, that's different than kind of how the drug will formally be applied. And I think that the way that treatment and the clinical research differentiate still remains to be seen. As I said earlier, we're having the first training in August of this year in Louisville, Kentucky, exclusively for therapists of color, and also for community organizers and people who work with these groups, which is really exciting, because although prior and other kind of training modules that we do are exclusively for the therapist, the idea here is that building community around, especially people of color who need access to this medicine, is not just looking at the therapists themselves, but also other people within the community, like clergy, like social workers, like community organizers and others, to ensure that the ecosystem that's available when MDMA is legal is more than just kind of like the kind of super kind of you might say delineated clinical model, which is not necessarily acceptable to, or accessible to all communities. That's exciting for me, because it's not just bringing forward a lot of therapists of color to actually make sure that we have a critical mass of therapists of color within the therapist cohort in general, but it's also exciting because it means we're gonna get like 60 opinions from people about the current protocol, which means that I think we'll start to see adaptations of the protocol into practice as we get closer and closer to actual therapeutic application, which is exciting, because I kind of envision a paradigm where we have like the standard protocol and then a whole bunch of kind of interpretations of it or comments on it from different people that work with refugees, that work with Black Americans, that work with Muslims, that work with different populations and the intersections there. And I kind of like the idea of there being kind of a huge diversity of access to different kinds of ways that the modality can be applied in different contexts. And this training is kind of setting the groundwork for expanded access, which, as a lot of you know, is really just FDA permission for some practitioners to utilize the medication MDMA prior to approval, which means that there could very well be legal MDMA therapy happening outside of the clinical context as early as the end of this year. Unfortunately, for those of you that are involved in that process, we still don't have an update on exactly when that timeline is going to happen, because FDA keeps pushing it back. So hopefully we'll have more information this summer, but that's still moving forward. So, and I can take more questions about that later, and also I'm easy to find, but just by way of a general kind of update, I also want to kind of link in a question that I've been getting a lot, which is, what the heck does local decriminalization have to do with research? And I just want to acknowledge that and kind of speak a little bit about that before going into the other pieces of this talk. So, first off, shout out again to Oakland for doing the work y'all did. A lot of the people who made that happen are in this room, so I'm so grateful for that. So I was at Lightning in a Bottle giving a talk at like the day after, a couple days after Denver voted. And the universal feeling there was, Denver, don't F it up. Like, you'll have to do it right, because if anything goes wrong, then they're all gonna have something to jump on. And I kind of feel the same way about Oakland, so we really have to get our stuff together and make sure that we're really serious and careful about how we're moving this forward. And I just want to appreciate part of what I was reflecting on earlier when I was talking about how great this community is that I actually really do trust the people in this room and the people here to be moving this conversation forward, whether it's from the perspective of education or from the perspective of how to actually grow the plants and how to have wonderful sacred gardens and all the things in between. But just to get a little bit more practical, so the implications of the decriminalization initiatives are really significant symbolically. They're very significant from the perspective of the extent to which local law enforcement will or will not interact with the laws relating to these substances. Those things are huge. At the same time, and this is kind of confusing, I think, to a lot of people, the local decriminalization initiatives don't necessarily impact the research. So because a lot of the research that's happening is happening at the federal level, and because the FDA process and the process of medicalization happens also at the federal level, although theoretically speaking, moving forward and decriminalizing at the local level could make it easier for future efforts for advocates to kind of bring the therapy into the locality, or kind of make it easier for people that are already there to participate at some point in the future. All of the efforts that we know of kind of when we think of the research and the science, because it all happens at the federal level, is really kind of in a different legal paradigm from what's happening at the local level. That does not mean what's happening at the local level is not important. In fact, because they're coming from different directions, one being kind of formal therapy research and one being more about decriminalization and access in a different context, I would actually say that they support one another in the long run for creating kind of an ecosystem as a whole that makes these substances available in a way that's not just relevant to a variety of populations, but also accessible to people who have different levels of need. And I don't just mean like financial and economic need, but I also mean that people with extreme chronic PTSD need a certain kind of dedicated care that healthy normals may not, working with the same kind of substance. So that's kind of what I mean, where we're talking about a spectrum of use, a spectrum of access, and that's a spectrum of kind of quality control, access to accountability, et cetera, when we're talking about how to actually like build systems to create the access. So that said, we're also seeing potential changes in the state laws. So Oregon's going forward, although they're rewriting the law right now, so we'll see what the final version that gets approved actually looks like. There's efforts in California. Similarly, efforts to change the laws in California and Oregon and various states would also not necessarily have a direct effect on the research, because none of the research is approved at the state level. It is the case, however, that after FDA approval happens, some of the efforts, there will have to be effort made at the state level to create access, because about half of the states don't automatically reschedule when the federal government does, which means that in about half of the states in the US, there will have to be local efforts to reschedule the drug in order for it to be available. Sometimes it'll be automatic, sometimes it's through the governor, there's kind of different ways in different states, but that state level move could actually make it easier on the back end once we actually have FDA approval, or once we have like federal changes at the federal level. And of course, we are seeing, as a result of this kind of general shift of kind of political acceptance of psychedelics in general. Some of you might have seen that there was some energy going around psychedelics with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez this week. Did anyone pay attention to that? I was so sad I was out of the country. I was like, wow, like this is like a really interesting vortex of a lot of really cool things happening all at the same time. But I just want to share a little bit of behind the scenes kind of information on this, because it's a really interesting example and case study of like how the political strategy actually operates in different contexts. So we actually had nothing to do with AOC moving forward on that legislative amendment. Like, we heard about it after they had already decided they were going to do it. For those of you that know Dan Riffle, he worked for the Marijuana Policy Project. He is currently the senior policy advisor to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So it's kind of no surprise that she's already moving forward with progressive drug policy reform, because she has really solid drug policy people on her team. But contrary to popular belief, we actually did not reach out to her, although I would have loved to. We didn't reach out to her. That was really just like her and Dan and that team deciding that they wanted to move forward on the amendment to make the research easier. However, one of the really interesting things about this is that we were reached out to about getting co-sponsors for that bill after it had already been decided. Now, we are frequently criticized because part of MAPS' political strategy is to work with Republicans and people on the right. That is worth criticizing, and I look forward to a continued ongoing debate and dialogue about how to handle this, because it is a really complicated issue. And I really, really do welcome engaging with these issues. I mean, just the fact that, for example, we spend so much of our time and energy working with people who you'd expect to be opposing this work, but who end up kind of really rapidly shifting their perspective once they get access to the data and once they realize that the problems that we're trying to solve are not ones that are necessarily localized to one specific population, but rather something that's more broad. But through some interesting series of events, so we have really strong connections to Matt Gaetz's office. I don't know if y'all know who Matt Gaetz is, but he is a Florida House, he's a representative from the House of Representatives in the state of Florida. He's, according to GQ, quote, the Trumpiest congressman in Trump's Washington. So he's a 35-year-old House of Representatives person. He's really, really the Trumpiest person in the House. A Republican, in case you haven't figured that out. But it just so happens that he's actually one of the biggest advocates of federal cannabis science policy change. So he's been someone who we've worked with and other people who have worked with who are really trying to move federal cannabis policy change. So we were able to, as a result of this connection that we have, to have the co-sponsor for AOC's psychedelics legislative amendment to be Gaetz. So we actually ended up having the Democrat that the Republicans love to hate the most and the Republican that the Democrats love to hate the most co-sponsoring a bill together, which ended up getting voted down, unfortunately. But it's, I think, the first time that they've paired on something, and it may be the last. But I just say that because it's interesting that we're in this paradigm where I mean, people know MAPS receives funding from people who are identified and aligned with the far right. We also receive funding from people who are identified and aligned with the far left, and that particular position really turns into strange alliances and turns into, kind of practically speaking, outcomes like this. And I just say that to really demystify some of both the political strategy that we follow and also kind of what actually that means on a practical level. Hopefully that means in the future when either Gaetz or AOC or some other person puts forward another legislative amendment like this, that we're able to actually engage with it, in a bipartisan or nonpartisan way, whatever that actually means, but really do that in a way that allows the education and demystification of the process to lead the advocacy, instead of kind of making it about persuasion, about changing people's opinions, really more about educating people and having them come to the opinion that they fall on their own. So that's a bit of a vortex. If you're interested on kind of general thoughts about decriminalization, legalization of psychedelic substances, my amazing colleague Natalie Ginsburg and I just published a document called The Considerations for the Decriminalization and Regulation of Psychedelic Substances. You can find it at maps.org/policy reform. Maps.org/policy reform. What was that? Yes, maps.org/policy reform. Considerations for the legalization and regulation of psychedelic substances. Or excuse me, decriminalization and regulation of psychedelic substances. There's a lot of words in there, but it's basically just like a kind of an overall perspective from our end about like how we should or can move forward with decriminalization, given that we've got some awesome people in cities like Denver and Oakland that are moving forward either way. With or without, exactly, with or without us. And actually, just to say on that, like, a lot of it is without us, and we see that as a good thing. I certainly don't want MAPS to be the one kind of doing all of the major policy change, and the idea that there's kind of homegrown, kind of organic change happening, I see as a really good thing, and I think the idea that we're gonna see a lot of diversity of perspectives on how this change happens at the local level throughout the US in the near future is definitely a good thing, and over time that will hopefully lead to coalitions between all of these awesome advocates and communities that are working together on this. So, a little bit about the paradigm we're in. So I kind of already touched on some of this, but we're in a paradigm, a political paradigm where the people who are on the sides that we disagree with are pretty aggressive and pretty successful at their strategy. We have in the United States seen the similar shift to the far right politically that we see in countries like Poland and Brazil and a number of other countries that are also happening simultaneously around the world. And that marks kind of this really interesting both challenge and opportunity, where people who are interested in policy change, interested in engaging with creating justice in the world, have to figure out how to navigate the current paradigm to do so. Although there are ways to, and I do see people, and I think like especially looking at the gardens, like this is why I think this narrative of the garden is so critical. I see the garden as a place where like it isn't reactive. Like I kind of see the garden, the herbs, this particular angle of earth-based work as non-reactive, and I really want that to be cultivated, if you will. But working within kind of the mainstream political paradigm, a lot of it is actually reactive, and it requires, especially within drug policy, to be fighting against a paradigm that's really, really harmful actively to a lot of people. So there are a number of issues that kind of we see would kind of emerge and that have really like made themselves super visible in the current kind of political paradigm. So, and I'll just name a few just to kind of like put them out there and maybe start a bit of a conversation about like what those could look like. So, and they all kind of go to concerns that I've heard come up with respect to the way that both medicalization is happening, that decriminalization is happening. We're looking at kind of different perspectives on the paradigms that we could be entering, and I just want to name them, at least some of the ones that I've noticed, to see kind of where people fall. So one is this discrepancy between people whose access could or may remain criminalized while it becomes accessible to others. So there's a lot of concern that as we legalize or medicalize a substance, that the continued criminalization of that substance means that some people, likely people with money and access to health insurance, will have access to the medicine, to the benefits that these substances can have, while other people who don't have access to that, whether they aren't able to pay for it or they don't have insurance or whatever else, like don't have access to that. And I think that's a very legitimate concern. And I think that's one also that I'm curious to see actually play out. There aren't that many examples of this kind of dichotomy occurring. GHB is one, but otherwise it's generally the case that when we see more access to and more interest in and more demystification of a substance over time, that society as a whole tends to become more accessible, accepting of it. Of course, you have clear counterexamples to that, like opioids, where you have like a huge amount of access, but now a huge amount of simultaneous demonization as a result because of kind of the auxiliary effects of that. And I don't know if you heard, but Insys Pharmaceuticals, which makes the fentanyl subpatches, just declared bankruptcy this week after all of the prosecutions from the Department of Justice, which is a huge, huge step. And I kind of see what's happening with Insys and Purdue comparable to what was happening with the cigarette companies in the 1990s and early 2000s, where there's like a lot of energy toward really holding them accountable by making them pay a lot of money. And we'll see how that actually turns out. People have been trying to sue Purdue for about 15 years, and some has been successful, some not. So it's really interesting to see how that actually will articulate itself in the pharmaceutical world, but it does suggest that there's kind of a mass understanding of the harm that these kind of paradigms have moved forward in. So that's totally fair. The other, which is limited, or which is related, is the idea that mainstream medicine is costly, limited in scope, and inaccessible to many. So some of you may have heard that we're expecting the MDMA treatment, the whole protocol, 48 to 52 hours of therapy, 15 sessions with a 3, assisted with MDMA, to be something like $10,000 to $15,000, which to a single person paying all at once is a lot of money. And it's definitely something that will have to be handled, and the accessibility question around financial access will have to be also kind of dealt with and understood. I will say that the huge percentage of that cost is therapist hours. Like the idea of having 2 therapists that are highly skilled that are paying at full cost, like that's really like the bulk of it. The drug itself is not so expensive, but the kind of zooming out perspective is that because in the US we live in a payment for healthcare model, because we're talking about something where most of the time people are having, the people who are able to access healthcare are people who have access to insurance. When you look at like the Veterans Administration or an insurance company, paying $10,000 to $15,000 for someone's treatment that then reduces or completely eliminates their PTSD symptoms is way better than spending $150,000 to $500,000 over the course of their life keeping them alive with antidepressants. So it kind of depends. So if we have the point of payment on the person themselves, then we've got a really big problem, and that's where a lot of the questions really need to come up. And because of the current paradigm in the U.S., that is an issue. And I think that as we look at Europe, examples where the countries are the payers, where we look at the Veterans Administration or other entities where you have extremely large payers paying for the main kind of bulk of that, it's actually a pretty big bargain for them. And the idea at this point is to help them realize that they should be paying, get the departments of health to pay, get the VA to pay, get people to actually do that. And hopefully by the time it's legal, 2021, we'll have elected a new person and got universal health care. So maybe we won't even be dealing with this problem at all in the first place. We'll see. I think that Lenice and Sunshine, who are going to be speaking tomorrow and Sunday, will speak to this a lot more, but this movement will become an industry faster than we are ready for, whether we like it or not. That's really what happened with cannabis already. A lot of you cannabis people are in the room, you've seen it. And it's not something that it's something that we can participate in and really want to have clear accountability for. And I just say that to just put forward that I am under no illusion that now that you have Wuhan, which is a Chinese company putting in $25 million, Atai, which just raised $40 million, Johnson & Johnson, which just approved Spravato, now that you have lots of players with a lot of money, there are not MAPS nonprofits that are raising by donations, they have investors. It's really just a matter of time before we see that shift. Some of you in the cannabis industry already know this, but there's a general consensus that in 2016, when a number of states legalized adult use, the kind of big push of cannabis legalization efforts started coming more from lobbyists than from the movement. It was about 2016 that shift happened, where it was more money coming from lobbyists and companies than it was from the movement itself. Thankfully, we're not there yet, but I just say that because we are really now setting the groundwork for what we believe is what we believe is a movement that is created in integrity. And I think that people here in this room having these conversations really have the power to really bring that message forward. And I think, for example, what's happening in Oakland, how to educate a city about how to utilize psychedelics responsibly, that is a microcosm for how we're going to have to apply this kind of educational policy to kind of the entire country. Because we can do all we want to fight Atai, we can do whatever we want to fight Wuhan, these massive companies that are putting a lot of money, but ultimately a lot of that is going to have to do with how much can we educate the people that are actually going to be in need of these substances, and that's in some ways a huge part of what we're able to do. This all kind of boils down to a number of risks and challenges that are inherent in creating new modalities and kind of bringing the underground into the above ground, where in some ways legalization means permission to commodify, and it means permission to engage into the market. And I actually say that because this can kind of, right now we see it as this really horrible, scary thing, where we're seeing what it means to be bringing these powerful substances into a system that really is very, very, very good at marketing. I think that's totally fair and very scary. Just the fact that my brother literally works for Ease, and I look around and I see these billboards, I'm whoa, I don't know if I want cannabis billboards. I love cannabis, I'm a huge fan, but I don't know if I want billboards. So I just really also feel and understand where that fear is coming from. And I want to just throw in a few pieces, which kind of brings us into the second phase, this last phase about the alchemy, and kind of how we can use some of this momentum in a way that I think is actually generative. So big things going on, multifaceted reality, a lot of really scary shifts happening that a lot of people are aware of and really critical of for very good reason. But I want to kind of use an example to kind of see how we can link some of these issues. So we have this problem where right now, in order to have access to this medicine, you have to have access to healthcare, and you also have to have a diagnosis. And right now, the diagnosis thing is really critical, because in order to have a diagnosis, you have to have access to a healthcare provider who understands what you're talking about. People who are Black, people who are trans, people who are of basically any identity that does not already fit within the traditional mainstream Western American model, are underdiagnosed, they are already receiving inadequate and unbalanced access to healthcare. And because of that, when we think about entering something into the traditional healthcare model, we risk kind of these discrepancies actually getting bigger. So this issue of diagnostic medicine, access to diagnosis, is a pretty big one that I don't think is talked about enough. But there's an interesting flip side to that. So I'm going to use the example of plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery. So when cosmetic surgery and plastic surgery was first a thing, it was really only for people who experienced wounds on the battlefield, people who had been permanently injured and needed some sort of reconstructive surgery. Over time, that changed to become people who were experiencing mental distress as a result of the way they looked or the way that they actually, like, that their bodies were. Over time, that became what we now know as plastic surgery. It's basically the consumerification of the process, where you no longer needed a diagnosis to get plastic surgery. So today, I don't need a diagnosis to just get psychotherapy. I can just go to a psychotherapist's office and ask for psychotherapy. But once medical psychedelics are available, you will need a diagnosis to get that. Interestingly, the consumerification of psychedelic therapy could mean that through that paradigm, we're actually looking at a direction where the medicine becomes available without the need for a diagnosis. That's a really big deal because, as I was saying, because access to a diagnosis is actually a privilege that a lot of people don't think about, in order to move forward on actually ensuring that healthy normals, if you will, or people who don't have access to a diagnosis are also able to access it, what some call, the kind of just the use for wellness in general, where we could see this weird trend of commodification actually working to make it more accessible through the medical paradigm. That really, I think, can only be fairly balanced out if we have efforts like the people who are doing decriminalization work to ensure that there's also non-medical paradigms where that's available and safe. So that also means moving beyond medicine in general. So that means right now we're thinking about psychedelics within the context of medicine because that's the way that it's moved forward in a formal sense. But there's actually, the reality is that political and cultural change has been part of psychedelic practice from the beginning. And I want to give a quick example of that. So in Colombia, which is where my family's from, or part of my family's from, there was this phenomenon where over the course of a 52 civil war, which was technically declared a truce about 2 years ago, there are huge plots of land that were generally occupied by indigenous people that were taken over by the guerrilla and that became drug smuggling corridors. So when the truce was declared a few years ago, many of the guerrilla disbanded. But that you had like a period from about the early 70s into about the 2010s or so where you have a generation of people who did not have access to their ancestral lands, and as a result, tend to become more successfully assimilated. So you have elders who had worked with yahe, with ayahuasca, with plant medicine, and then you have a generation or two of people who were assimilated, who did not have access to their land, who did not have access to that, and then the young ones. Now, as a result of this increasing shift in globalization of access to ayahuasca, there's suddenly interest with the youth to be kind of re-interested in this practice. And now you have in Colombia, in Putumayo, and other places, you have the elders now teaching the young people how to re-relate to their land using the medicine now that the guerrilla are gone. This is not just healing work. This is not just medicinal work. This is like political, cultural creation. And I say that because we have, right now, our model is a bit limited because we think of psychedelics as medicine because that's like the angle. And it is true that that's the case. But, critiquing it, as we critique it, I really want us to push past that narrowness of the understanding of psychedelics as just a medicine and really understanding them as political tools, as social political tools that can be used for the creation of identity. And that's a huge kind of piece of this kind of idea of bringing them into this kind of reparative framework. So lastly, in this piece, I'll add this kind of that implies the possibility of incorporating psychedelic healing into the systems that most need to be restored, repaired, and regenerated. So as I said earlier, I'm really excited about all the talks about food and herbs. Like there's a talk about food later, there's a talk about herbs, there's more talks about that. And I was about to say I'm not a land person. I am a land person that's relearning how to be in relation to the land, but I just say that because it's like, it really feels to me like the most critical thing. Another reason why I think like looking at this angle of like the criminalization of nature, or our relationship to nature as being really persuasive as far as like an advocacy tool. But I really want us to think like when we're thinking about regeneration beyond PTSD. So as I said earlier, expanding past the limitations of diagnostic-based care. This idea of full spectrum integration. So imagine if we had integration for people that had psychedelics, or that could use psychedelics as part of reentry. Leaving prison. We think a lot about like PTSD from going to war, but I think we really don't have enough time. There isn't enough kind of energy spent on the trauma of actually being incarcerated and what it means to, if we want to actually have a mass decarceration movement or a mass abolition movement where we're actually talking about prison reform in a real way, we're also talking about literally millions of people that are going to need to be reintegrated with actual care and support. It's not just giving them a psychedelic so their trauma is over and then getting them back into the system. It means jobs, it means housing, it means access to community and a lot of other pieces. So I really see like psychedelics as being part of this ecosystem that's not just about like the medicine, again, like not reducing it to that point of access. And then also like for grief, for divorce, for death, for forced migration, like there's so many levels to where I think that it can be implemented as an intervention, but again, it cannot be done so in a vacuum. And then lastly, I'll say this idea of like health equity, which is kind of this idea that I've been circling around access to care. That means that we need some of these heavy hitters to be willing to put the money down to actually pay for the treatment of a lot of people. And I think when we think about reparations in the context of health equity, we can look at like mapping out like to what extent are we looking at health discrepancies in different populations, and how can that be impacted by psychedelics or by access to psychedelic substances. And I don't just mean like necessarily MDMA. I also mean like we're talking about like I know people that are trying to bring peyote back to indigenous communities that have lost it for 100 years, indigenous people that are trying to do that with other indigenous groups in the US. I think that there's a lot of levels too where we can think about the substances themselves, how they're applied in which contexts. And again, not as silver bullets, not alone in a vacuum, but really as kind of one piece of a full spectrum intervention. And that brings me to this idea of what do I mean by after prohibition? So the title of this talk is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, so When the World is Just, Psychedelic Science After Prohibition. The joke is that ending prohibition does not necessarily bring us closer to justice. It's a huge piece of that, but after prohibition, there will still be a death economy. There will still be a prison system, there will still be patriarchy, there will still be capitalism, there will still be racism. The prohibition is a tool of those systems that is extremely effective at getting the outcomes it wants, which is social control of particular populations. But the idea that we can dismantle prohibition and the possibility of dismantling prohibition, which is one of the very effective systems of implementing that oppression, shows us that we can then utilize those tools of dismantling in order to recreate, regenerate, or fully dismantle if we need to other systems. But I'm not just a dismantler. I'm not interested in just destruction. I'm actually interested in the creation and regeneration of new systems. So I think a part of the conversation is not just like how do we take things down, although that's critical, and shout out to the people here who are taking things down. It really is also about ensuring that there's some system that is able to hold space for the people who rely on those problematic systems, whether or not they want to. And I think that this kind of brings me to this idea, like you hear a lot of people like within like the tech world talk about blockchain and like the future of the internet. And also people who are talking about like getting off of Facebook, for example. Like I think that, you know, there's these ideas are getting off of like our reliance on oil. These are all really good critical ideas, and like right now, most of the third world also relies on oil. We can't just like shift things and forget that there are a lot of people who have been forced to rely on systems that are harmful that also need to be considered when we're thinking about change. And that bridge building is actually some of the real magic. It's really not just about like shifting over the new system because it all works now, because even if we might have access to it in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, that doesn't mean that everyone else will. So there's that amazing quote, it's like, if it's not accessible to the poor, it's neither radical nor revolutionary, and I think that's really, really, really solid, and I think a really good kind of just baseline, which again comes back to the idea of the gardens, comes back to the idea of what's actually accessible to all people. Lastly, I'll just say that the work isn't done when prohibition ends. You know, the first time I was ever invited to participate in a drug policy conversation, it was at the Drug Policy Alliance's Reform Conference in 2015. Amanda Ryman invited me to participate on a panel called Beyond Prohibition. And, you know, in 2015, we had not really, we didn't have adult use in California. They had, I think Colorado, Washington, Oregon had legalized, but we were just starting to think about, not even really, right? So we were just starting to think about like what are we even talking about when we're thinking about beyond prohibition? And I think that now, almost 5 years later, we can really look at what actually happened in Colorado, which is this to say that like arrests for Black and brown youth didn't actually decrease that much at first. We can look at like stats that kind of show that, you know, we can make major policy change, and also if we don't also make ideological, social, and cultural change, that may not be implemented in the way that we actually hope it will. So I just say this not as a warning, although maybe a little bit of that, but more as like kind of a call to acknowledge that like it's not just the structure, the logistics of the policy change that we're making that's going to create the world that we're trying to build. It does have to do with our interactions, it does have to do with our ideologies, and it does have to do with our ability to see the picture both really, really specifically, you know, sometimes like how do we bring the people together on this amendment to make this specific political change, and also on the macro level, like what are we really fighting for, and how do we make sure that we're not moving forward on policy changes that we are going to have to undo later, which again, the cannabis people really, really, really know what I'm talking about here. So I have a few minutes for questions, but before that, I just want to take a moment to just like bring us back to this idea. Like we were just thinking, like, what the heck are we gonna do when the world is just? Like a lot of the activists I work with, it's a game that we play. It's like, when the world is just, I just want to be an interior designer because I won't have to deal with border migration issues. Or like when the world is just like, I can't wait to just like design shoes or something, you know, which is actually like what I would love to do, but I can't do that because things are too messed up. We have too much work to do. So I really hope that all of you like have some sort of backup plan because we've got work to do, and maybe in some of our lifetimes we can see somewhere where we actually can like take a step back, take a breather, make some killer food, which I should say, Emma, is also a really powerful level of activism, so thank you all so much. Yeah, I would love to take some questions. I'd love to hear any thoughts. I think that there's only a few minutes, maybe like one question.
Thanks a lot for all your work, Izzy, and that was a pretty amazing quick summation of a lot of stuff. What's the impetus and reasoning behind Denver and Oakland's wanting to go to something like mushrooms, which is kind of, I mean, not completely fringe, but not totally mainstream? Why would they go to that and now?
Well, if the DNO people could raise their hand really quick, I would totally recommend reaching out to them and checking in. They're right behind you in the pews over there. Definitely ask them after. But I will say that strategically speaking, that's a really good question. The thing about mushrooms, which is really interesting, is that mushrooms are one of the few kind of substances on this list that's actually indigenous to the United States. So that's one thing, it grows here. And it's definitely something that is kind of part of the global tradition. Like we in the US, because we were introduced to it through the Mazatec Mexican tradition, think of it as something that came from Central America, but mushrooms are indigenous entheogenic practices that are kind of pretty global. South America, North America, Africa, Central West Asia, East Asia. So that's one kind of like, there's a universal aspect to it there. And I think just like practically speaking, also, you know, I was thinking about this in the context of like decriminalizing all of a number of entheogenic plants, which is that like, you know, if you grow ayahuasca or if you grow like even iboga, like you can't like bite on the vine and like get high. Like there's a process involved. The thing about mushrooms is that you can grow a bathtub of them and then you can eat them. Like we were eating mushrooms as a species before we domesticated fire. And I just say that because I think that that really, really ancient element of it has actually made it kind of in some ways easier for people to accept as something that like should not, at the very least, not be criminalized. That's my take on it, but there's a lot of interpretations and you should totally talk to them about it, so. Thank you all so much.